So in the book, you talk about how failure actually is responsible for something that's ubiquitous in every office space, the Post-it. So can you kind of talk about that and then maybe give us an action item that we all can practice at home to kind of increase our comfort level with failure?
So the 3M's great invention of the Post-it note, which is probably their greatest product ever, and certainly the most used thing in anyone's office, really came about because of a mistake. There was a scientist at 3M who was trying to create a sticky product, right? I mean, they're all about tape. 3M is all about tape. And the product was a huge failure because this concoction, this recipe, wasn't very sticky at all. In fact, it had the feature that once you pressed it down, you could actually just lift it right up. Well, what kind of tape is that? So it was just kind of shelved, and that was it. Well, a little bit later, there was a colleague of this scientist who was trying to put bookmarks in his hymnal so that he could find places. And the bookmarks kept falling out. So he wanted to kind of affix the place marks in without damaging the hymnal. And he remembered, hey, what about that, my colleague's, crazy failed attempt? And he kind of lathered some of this sticky, concoction on, and it stuck to the hymnal, and then it would come right off. And then all of a sudden people said, aha. Now we see what to do. So that's an example. So we talk about failure in many, many different directions. That's an example of how a failed attempt to do one thing might be a brilliant insight into doing something else. So there's an example of that. But in terms of an action item for failing, one thing that we say is if you have to do something that's really hard, whether it's writing a paper, whether it's dealing with a report, dealing with a committee, working at something business in school, if you got to do it really quickly, really poorly. Just do it. Just sit down and just do it. And you're going to produce junk and garbage. But within that mess, you might find gems. And all of a sudden, it will start to organize your thinking and your ideas. And now you iterate. And now you begin a process of refining and refining and failing. And all of a sudden, bang, you've got it. And in fact, that literally is how he wrote the book. This book, which only has 160 some odd pages, took us over 7 years to write. If you figure that out, how many pages per day, it's ridiculous. But the idea is that by iterating, we were able to produce something that we thought was the right thing for us to produce.
So I'm going to jump into questions and air now. A large portion of this section is about formulating the right questions. And how do you go about doing that? So can you give us another anecdote and then again another action item? And I'm actually I have a preference here for the action item related to the election.
Well, first of all, questions are an important way of going through life. And asking the right question or even the wrong question, just creating questions produces a different inner life experience. One thing that I do in my classroom is I actually pick at the beginning of each class, each lecture, an individual at random out of like a deck of cards who are going to be the official questioners of the day. And their job is to ask at least one question during the lecture, even if they didn't think they had one. It forces them to treat that class in a different way. They have to really pay attention, they have to really think, and all of a sudden they're engaged at a richer level. So that's the power of questions. Having the answers sometimes isn't even as important as being in the habit of creating the questions, quite frankly. So it's kind of a paradox. We're not saying you have to do the questions solely to get the answer. But in fact, the question is a way in itself because it allows you to all of a sudden see things that you might be able to answer on your own. In terms of elections, there's a lot of heady times that follow that precede any election. And whether it's at the state level or the federal level or any kind of level, and there's a lot of hyperbole and a lot of advertising and sound bites. And so, when you have your candidate, it is your civic responsibility to actually create the right questions to make sure that they are, in fact, truly representing that which you believe, those philosophies that you embrace, and not to just take the 30-second soundbite and the little commercial, but to really say, okay, what's the right question to ask this candidate, and ask the candidate and get that answer. And that helps us actually generate an informed citizenry.
So the fourth element, which is understanding the flow, that ideas flow from one to the other, this is a multi-directional flow. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think a lot of people think ideas exist in the here and now. So if you could elaborate on that, that would be wonderful.
It's great because, when you teach anything, especially math, you often get the kind of question, how did anyone ever come up with this? Well, the fact that someone would even ask that question, which is a very natural question, the way we teach things, it basically shows that we have stripped, as teachers, we have stripped away all the humanity, all the actual natural progression that led to that idea, and instead just offered it in the slickest, coolest, most direct, polished way. Ideas do become more polished, but the thing is, then you lose kind of where they came from. It's so important to realize how an idea came into being. It actually makes it easier. Sometimes students say, well, it's just easier for me to memorize the formulas. Well, it might seem that way on paper, but without that meaning, which comes from understanding where the formulas came from, how they derived, why they were created to begin with, now all of a sudden there's a story in my head, and a story is a lot easier to remember than random quantum little facts that I just have to hold in my head and that are independent to each other. Now there's a storyline, an intellectual story that allows me to kind of actually feed off itself and say, now I see, of course that's where it is. So that's why it's important to understand where ideas came from, going into an idea, but then once you're in the here and now, in today's society, the common practice is, hey, I've got a new idea, let's get balloons and a cake and celebrate. But that's the place, if you embrace the mindset that Mike Starbird and I are proposing, that's the place where the work begins. That's the moment you start working. You have a new idea, either new to you or someone else's idea that you first see. The first thing you say is, this is really interesting. What else can I do with it now? Where does it lead me to? What can I do? By doing that, by having that mindset, all of a sudden now you're innovating into the future. So there's a flow from the past, which allows you to understand the present better. So you'll just do better in school and you'll have better understanding and a richer understanding. And once you see a new idea, by forcing yourself to say, what can I do next, allows you to begin to innovate into the future.
Okay, and now the part that is probably going to be the most difficult, the fifth element, the quintessential element, change. I think that this is where a lot of people get hamstrung, basically, when they're trying to improve the way that they're thinking. So can you talk about how you help people get over that hump in the book?
This is where the rubber meets the road, because the quintessential element of change really just says, do the other four things. But this is a way to kind of remind you that something different is going to happen. A lot of times people today tend to be somewhat solid in how they look at the world and unmoving. And what we're trying to propose is an intellectual agility that allows you to say, you know what, I now see things differently and I now change. I change my mind, I change my thinking, I change what I believe because I see new evidence or because I see a new argument or because I just see things differently. And it's the lifelong learner, it's the person who's evolving that is open to actually say, you know what, I can change. And it's not a sign of weakness. In fact, it's a great sign of strength to say, you know what, I am a different person. I am a changed person. That's the point of education. But it's hard to do, and you have to embrace it, and you have to realize that it's not bad. You know, you watch these pundits talk on these, television programs, these news-type programs. It doesn't make a difference whether it's on the right-leaning channels or the left-leaning channels. It doesn't matter who's even speaking. If you watch that national discussion, that national debate on TV that are, of course, going for ratings, the conversation is always the same. I'm right, and you're arguing, no, you're right, and it goes back and forth, and you never hear in that discourse, in that debate, someone say, well, that's a good point. Okay, I'll give you that.
You've changed my mind.
Exactly. People are stubborn, and they don't want to change. But that is not the informed mindset. And if you look back as to how even our own government worked in years past, even though people had different philosophical views on government and politics, they would come together and they would compromise and they would actually change to allow the betterment of whatever the issue is. And today there's a frustration because people are afraid to change or don't want to change. And what we tried to argue and invite in this last chapter is that it's not only okay to change, but it is critical to change. And Mike and I both have changed so much over the years. Our teaching has evolved. It literally led to this book. And we're so proud that we can actually offer kind of this voice. But it's because of change. And so once we look at change, just like failure, people look at failure and say, oh, that's weak, that's bad. But in fact, instead of saying change, oh, you're wishy-washy, but instead, no. Thoughtful, careful, decided change allows us to grow into just better selves.
So in the book, you instruct your readers to read this book not once, but 3 times. Why is that?
Well, first of all, it's an invitation. We don't instruct anything. These are suggestions. And what we really wanted to do originally, we had this innovative idea of literally having the book be 3 times as thick and just repeating the book 3 times, so it'd be really, really thick and maybe even more expensive, which would be but you guys said no. Princeton University Press vetoed that idea.
Right.
So we had to put in the preamble that are instructions and suggestions to read the book 3 times. Because in fact, change is hard. So the first read, just read it through kind of casually, skim, read the parts you want, kind of get a sense of the big picture. Because there are these 5 elements, and it's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but they're all interconnected. In fact, if you look at kind of the neat symbol we have, they all kind of are together. And so they all work with each other. And so you want to get a kind of global sense of all of the stuff. So now all of it's in your head. You have the 5 elements in your head. Now read it a second time. And now read it with a little more care. And try to stop at each of the action items that we suggest and try to apply it to something. By the way, the fantasy for this book, in my mind, is that after you read the book 3 times, you kind of put it on the shelf or ideally keep it on your desk. And whenever you come across a vexing problem or an issue or something that you want to resolve, just pick up the book, open it up to a random page, find the nearest action item, wherever it is, and now apply it. Because it will be applicable. Whatever it is. These action items are action items that apply to anything. So, this second read through and think about the action items, try them out, and you'll see that, wow, they really do kind of help. And then the third read is what we call the transformative read. This is maybe the hardest one, because you now have to read it and begin to try to make these things part of who you are. Put these things into practice and make them actually part of how you think and live your life. And that's the hard one. But we think that in 3 reads, you'll be kind of well on your way to being the absolute coolest, best, strongest, smartest, most imaginative, creative person that you are capable of being. And by the way, wherever an individual is, including you and me, quite frankly, we can be even greater. And that, I think, is maybe the greatest triumph of the human spirit. That wherever we are, wherever our lot in life is, intellectually or otherwise, we can, by intent, change and be even more, be even greater. And this book tries to offer something in the direction of that conversation.
Thank you very much for joining me today. I hope that everybody enjoyed this conversation with Ed Berger, the co-author with Mike Starbird of 5 Elements of Effective Thinking. Thank you.